So we are rounding up the determination of wage rates. So today we want to talk about bilateral monopoly. And when we talk about bilateral monopoly, we're simply talking about the monopsonist and the monopoly. So the monopoly is going to be that body that organizes workers in a collective unit. That is the trade union. So it's going to act as the supply side of that market. And we have the monopsonist, which is going to act as the demand side of that market. So the combination of both of them give us what we call the bilateral monopoly. So here I wrote, a bilateral monopoly in the labor market is a situation where a single organized body of workers, that's a trade union, act as a monopoly on the supply side and faces a single powerful employer, which is the monopsonist on the demand side. So in this market structure, both the union and the monopsony employer possesses significant bargaining power, leading to intense negotiation to determine the wage rate and employment level. So both of them have significant market power. And that means that whenever negotiation is coming up or whenever there's negotiation, it's always intense. So the outcome of that negotiation is indeterminate, which simply means that it depends on who has more negotiating skill that wins. So the negotiating power, that means the relative bargaining power of each party will determine who wins what. So, however, the actual outcome in terms of wages and employment is interdeterminate and depends on the relative bargaining power of each party. So, both of them will have to negotiate. So, the resistance of the employer, which is the monopsonist, might make the wage rates to fall. But if the monopsonists are unable to resist the negotiation or whatever the monopoly is bringing to them, then it is expected that in that market, the wage rate is expected to increase. Do you get the point I'm making here?
Yes.
So that takes us to the characteristics of a bilateral monopoly. Excuse me. You have a question?
No.
Okay. Go to the characteristics of a bilateral monopoly. The first characteristic of a bilateral monopoly is single buyer and single seller. So we talk about single buyer because the monopsonist is the only one that demands for labor. So it is the only buyer of labor. Then we have the monopoly, which is the union, which is the only seller of labor. I think the first point is clear.
Yes, clear.
Yeah. The second one is conflicting objectives. The objective in a bilateral monopoly, both of them have different objectives. For a trade union, they want higher wages for their members, which means if it is possible for them to negotiate for a wage rate above the equilibrium wage rate, they're going to do that. And for this monopoly or the demand side of the bilateral monopoly, which is the monopsony, their own aim is to lower wage as less as possible to be able to maximize profits. So low wages is what their aim is. And for the monopoly, which is the trade union, they want higher wages. So that means there's conflicting objective within them. I think it's clear.
Yeah.
And the third one is bargaining power. Both parties have significant market power, which influences the wage and the employment outcome. So both of them have significant bargaining power, and this would influence the outcome in terms of wages that has to be paid and employment. That means in terms of the price and the quantity of labor. I think it's clear.
Yeah.
Any question about the characteristics
No.
of bilateral monopoly? Okay, good. So go to how wages and employment are determined in a bilateral monopoly. So we're going to start with the monopsony's goal. For the monopsonies, they want to employ workers where the MR, the marginal revenue product equals to they want to employ workers to the stage where to the point where the marginal revenue product of labor equals to the marginal cost of labor. But what do? They would not. Why? Because they have that significant market power. As a result of that, they exploit that market power by trying to pay a low wage below the competitive market price. Do you get the point here? So for a monopsony goal, the goal is to maximize profit anyway. So for them to maximize profit, they have to reduce the amount paid to workers. So what they do is what? They reduce the amount. And when they do that, what happens? They try to pay lower wages. And when they pay lower wages, they pay lower wages by reducing the numbers of employment. So they reduce the demand of employment and they pay a lower wage. So that is how they maximize their profits. So here I wrote monopoly's goal. A monopoly employer would ideally want to hire labor up to the point where the marginal revenue product equals to the marginal cost of labor. However, to achieve lower wage, they often exploit the power to pay less than the competitive market rate. So they want to pay less than the equilibrium market or the equilibrium wage rate. That is their bargaining power. So if they are able to resist the negotiation, or if they have edge over the monopoly, which is the trade union, then they'll be able to pay even less than what they are supposed to pay. And to do that, the only thing they have to do is to reduce the demand for labor. Do you understand the monopoly's goal? Then we have the union's goal. For the union, what they want to do is to ensure that they get a higher pay for their members, more than what the monopolist is willing to pay. You get the point here. A trade union would want to negotiate a higher wage above what the monopolist, which is the employer, is willing to pay. That is the union's goal. You get union's goal here?
Yeah.
So the union's objective is to secure a higher wage than the monopoly would offer. So they want to ensure that they are able to get a higher pay than what the monopolist is willing to pay to their members. Then we have the indeterminate outcome. For the indeterminate outcome, we're talking about the final wage and employment situation. So the final wage and employment depends on the effectiveness of the union's negotiation and the employer's resistance. It is bilateral monopoly, which simply means it involves both the monopolist, the employer, and the monopoly, which is the trade union. So the final outcome of that situation will be based on what? The effectiveness of the trade union's negotiation and the resistance of the employers. So if the employers are able to resist, then they have edge over the trade union. But if the trade union have edge over them, then they'll be able to increase the wages of their members. Is it clear?
Yeah.
Any question about that?
No.
Okay. So those are how wages are determined and employment within in a bilateral monopoly. The first one is monopoly's goals. What is their goal? What do they want to achieve? They want to make profit. And to make profit, what do they have to do? They have to reduce the numbers of employment through lowering the wage rate. For the union, the trade union also has its own goal, which is to increase the wage rate as much as possible than what the monopolist employer is willing to pay. Then the indeterminate outcome, which is simply both parties, how their negotiating power, the resistance of the employers, and the negotiating power of the trade union. So these are how wages are determined in a bilateral monopoly. Is it clear?
Yep.
Any question about that?
No.
Good. So we have the graph for figure 9 and 10. So the graphical representation of a bilateral monopoly. So we're going to start with where we have OA and OE for the employment. So without the trade union, a monopolist will be able to say, that means we're talking about if the monopolist is faced with large numbers of employees without the presence or without the intervention of the union. So a monopolist facing large numbers of employees will put the wage, will set the wage rate downwards to OE. Without the intervention of a union, the wage rate will be at OE and it will employ workers at OA. Do you understand? The monopolist could pay up to where the marginal cost equals to the marginal cost of labor equals to the marginal revenue product of labor, where MC equals to D. this point. A monotonist can pay at this point. You have the point there, right?
Yeah.
Where your MC equals to MD above it. So, but a monotonist is not going to pay at that point. Why? Because it has the bargaining power and there's no trade union intervention. So that is why it's going to pay. It's going to force wage rates downwards to OE and employ at OA. Do you understand the first point here, please?
Yes.
That's the first graph. Now, with trade union intervention at this point, with trade union intervention, a trade union would negotiate a higher pay, will set the minimum wage rate at OF. And if it is set at OF, it affects the supply of labor. It makes it to king. That means it distorts the marginal cost of labor. So here, it will set for, because there is a what we call trade union intervention, it will set the minimum wage at OF. At OF, then the supply curve of labor and the supply curve of labor would increase a bit, and it will bring about a gap in between the marginal cost and the marginal revenue for labor. So firms at this point, they can still employ more workers because they will still be able to make profit. Why? Because the marginal revenue product of labor is still bigger or greater than the marginal cost of labor. This is the marginal cost of labor, and the marginal revenue cost of labor is bigger. So firms will still be able to employ more workers here based on the fact that they will be able to make profit. They are not employing more workers because of the wage rate. They are employing more workers because of what the marginal revenue product is. So firms are not employing workers because they are paying a high wage rate. They are employing workers based on what the workers would bring in returns. So in as much as the marginal revenue product of labor is greater than the marginal cost of labor, firms will employ more workers because it will increase their profitability. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So the first graph for 9A is simply talking about where there is no trade union intervention. Without trade union intervention, a monopolist will reduce the wage rate to OE instead of paying where the marginal cost of labor equals to the marginal revenue product of labor. That's demand curve here. It will not pay this point. It will rather pay at OE here, and employment is at OA. With trade union intervention, then the wage rate will increase to OF. But that does not increase the marginal cost of labor. The marginal cost of labor is still reduced. So which simply means that the trade union will still be able, the monopolist will still be able to increase the numbers of workers based on the fact that it will be able to make more profit. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So that ends wage rate determination. Any question?
No.
Good.
Tomorrow we start market value and labor markets.
Yes.